thought it was a good debate, obviously. But I think that there's a couple things that I think both teams could do better that would make my decision easier. I think that like on the negative side, there's a big discussion in terms of the role of the judge and how I should interact within it, but not as much of a discussion of the role of the ballot. I sort of think the flip side for the affirmative is that there's a bigger discussion of the role of the ballot and less of a discussion in terms of the role of the judge. And where this becomes difficult for me to sort of sort these things out, right, is that your argument is that if I would vote for them as an affirmation of an identity, that affirmation would be something that I would then think is an easy maneuver where I have, validated myself as being, not racist, and then I could leave, and then I will realize that there's more racism out there that would then experience resentment, which is a reason for why that a affirmative ballot would be negative or counterproductive for myself. The question that I would then have left in my head is then, what does the role of the ballot when I vote negative do in that space? And I think that some of the conversations that exist earlier in the debate about how a role of the ballot is a radical rejection of liberalism is not necessarily as present at the end of the debate. And I think bringing those two things together is a good way to contextualize then what my ballot does to do something, opposed to just moving away from that and being this is the role of ballot versus the role of judge. I think for you all, I think the role of the ballot is very clear in terms of what it means for the two of you and how it exists in terms of the space and what it means for you to bring the identity forward and how we have to perform these forms of identity. And then the question for you two that I would like to have answers is that what does it mean for me to do that? Because you say it's not, the ballot is a way to give visibility, but obviously the visibility is not contingent solely on the ballot. Like if I don't vote for you, it doesn't go away. You're clearly not going to be the 07 team if you don't get my ballot, but the ballot clearly has a certain form of meaning. And what does that ballot do if it's not necessarily just a form of visibility? And I think that locating what a ballot means for me as a white male would be beneficial in figuring out how it relates to what it means when I, either leave this room or even within the space or things along those lines. And I think that if you bring that role of the ballot to not just who best performs their, political agency, but then who best, allows me to gain access to that agency or who best understands it. And I think that like in the cross-examination when they're like, well, how does the judge determine what's best? And you're like, well, whatever's best, right? That almost like allows me to determine what do I think is best. Is what you're doing best? Is that what they're doing is best? And you don't really want to put the judge in a position where they subjectively get to determine what's best or what's not best. And so I think having some sort of criteria, and I think you sort of do it in the 1AC where you lay out, here's the three different benefits that we have to our performance. That could be a way that we determine what is the best way to gain access to it, right? And then it could be, and then as you're saying that it's not a sentimentality, you could begin to sort of hash out why it isn't a form of sentimentality, or why what I'm voting for won't just be able to create, a resentment, or, more clearly foreground that it would be good to make a form, for me to experience that resentment, for me to have a moment of like, yes, I've done something, then, oh, no, I haven't done enough, so that way I continue to engage in this form of struggle, so that way, if I vote affirmative, it's not just a process that ends at that individual, at that individual point. All right. So those things being said, I end up voting affirmative, and I end up voting affirmative for essentially two different reasons. And first, I think might be a slippage that ends up happening in the 2NR when you say that that I shouldn't affirm their identity within debate, but I should affirm them outside of debate, right? And that's what the 2AR jumps on immediately. And I think that's smart of you to say that there's, the point that is everything about there's no inside-outside, which I think is incredibly responsive to you. Then what the ballot means for me to be able to vote for you suddenly forces that inside-outside where it's like, well, not here, but when we go outside and we have, breakfast tomorrow, then I could be like, hey, I really like the two of you. I affirm your identity. I heard what you said, right? And that, and I think that that's slippage because I leave the dollar evidence, and it's not doing that per se, but I don't think it's good enough for me to sort of correct the slippages that happen within that 2NR. And I think I think that gets to sort of the second reason for why I end up voting affirmative is that when I don't understand how I could do something with my ballot, how that ballot would be that radical liberal rejection, then it becomes, well, why not go ahead and experience a situation of struggling even as left to failure? And I line that up with their argument where they say that we need to affirm our own identities even when it's going to fail, right? The process of this form of violence is already non-unique. So the failure or engaging in this liberal form of subjectiness is like, yeah, sure, it's going to be co-opted, but if we're already there, how does that co-option even matter, right? So sort of like, non-unique in a traditional debate sense. And I think if you go back to sort of the original 1NC articulation, the cross-examination of that rejection of liberal commodification, I think that that would be really important. Also, I'm recording the round. I think you could play with that a little bit more. I'm recording it. Obviously, I'm going to watch it. I'm going to show it to my debaters. Those sort of things, right? It's doing those sort of actions that you're talking about when you're engaging in that. And you could be like, when you vote negative, not only will you vote negative to stop this from happening, but you'll vote negative to make sure that that video does not become a place that could be co-opted within a form of debate space, whether or not it is. Or you could be like, that video is important for that visibility, so that way people around the nation could see what we're doing in this space, and that's at individual time. And so you can sort of utilize what I'm doing within the space a little bit more. The other thing that I think that ends up getting me is that I think the Gilborn evidence is pretty good to the way that you all address the question of whiteness, because you're addressing this like, we're privileged because you go to Harvard, white and Asian, yet there's systems where you're not privileged as well, because you could go outside, you model minority, or you could be labeled as queer and these sort of things. But the Gilborn evidence indicates that the foregrounding of whiteness and the foregrounding of white privilege is not enough, because it makes things like white supremacy rendered even further invisible, which to me is being connected with their violent type arguments in terms of how whiteness operates in violent ways, and not just a way where I'm privileged by being white so I get advantages, but just having those advantages be like, I'm white, I'm privileged, ignores how that privilege is actively structured as a disadvantage to others, to like the two of them, to blacks, to Asians, any number of different other forms of minorities. And so I think that the discussion of your privilege doesn't get at how that privilege also oppresses others, right? It ends up being like, we are privilege, we recognize these things, now let's do these other things or reject the subject. But that privilege of how you exist does create other forms of disadvantages. So to me it's sort of like a half disclosure of the privilege, because it doesn't get into the negative effects that privilege then wraps back up with. And I think that connects to your argument, because then you're being like, it's a forced precedent of like, why I'm bad, why I'm good, this is how I have to have this resentment type things. And I think that if that discussion fleshed itself out a little bit more, I think you could get it to the point where it does those things. An argument that I think that you can make that is sort of like a forced presidency or a confessional type argument, when they say you must lead with a story of your identity, that must come first, right? What about the person who doesn't want to reveal that because of the violence that they've obscured? What happens if they've, experienced, horrific forms of rape, and that's the ways that they have had to do it, but they don't want to relive those experiences and tell that, and when they're like, you have to start with these experiences, even if they're not telling you what those experiences are, it sort of forces you to begin with that. And then as soon as you didn't, and you were like, this is obviously a discussion of, race and whiteness and things like that, and I get that, it's like, but then you didn't do it in the way they wanted to, and if that becomes sort of like a Foucauldian confessional type argument, where that confessional, and to me that's like almost basically your priest argument that you're going for early in the debate, is that becomes something that means that what they're doing is not just maybe not successful, but actively redeploys within debate spaces a form of oppression, where it means not just the two of you, but every time they do this argument, it's going to reinstitute different forms of racial, sexual, etc. forms of oppression. I like Puar Terrorist Assemblages have a question about forced confessionalism and the question of privilege and this sort of relation. And I think that the book talks about when people just talk about privilege and then move on without talking about the disadvantages is problematic. But at the same time, when people say you have to talk about privilege and you have to talk about the ways that you operate with there, it's forcing people to locate their social location in ways that could then be not only just co-opted, but actively mobilized against in destructive ways, so we can't truly be resistant. And I think that, teasing out that argument more in relation to the way they say you have to do it, I think would be sort of beneficial in that regards. And I think that, on the affirmative side of things, I think that when you say things like, you are just white, right? It is clearly whiteness. I think that you need to have more attention to sort of the nuances of the way it's being articulated, right? There is a white form of argumentation that may be happening, but that does not make Suo white, right? Even if he's adopting different forms of whiteness, and that putting race identity on them or on him is probably problematic to a certain extent. And I think that more focus on the 2 on R could be an argument going on. I don't think when you start saying, that's them being racist, I think is not necessarily the way to articulate it. I would do an articulation of the way that it creates fixed, stable identities that elides differences, that it doesn't allow us to be able to figure out ways that we could actively engage in spaces differently. Once you start saying that, this is when, as soon as they label someone as white as being racist, just seems to be like an inversion of the hierarchy that's like, now black people are being racist towards other races, opposed to sort of a articulation of how it's erasing the form of identity. As soon as he started to speak about his own identity, they said, stop doing that, you were just white in the beginning, right? And so that, I think that you should, it's like, he might have started out that way, but when he finally did what you wanted to, you were like, too late, and sorry, you're still white, right? And I don't think that that's a productive maneuver in terms of these discussions, and I also don't think it's a productive maneuver or a strategic maneuver in regards to the way the debate goes down. And I also think that the slippage of, I forget which one of you said it, but it was like, we're just so dark. Right, yeah. So that, right, like,
I was
that should be something that I would point out explicitly when they're so dark, and then you line that up to the argument where Sue is now suddenly white, right? This is now, I vote the team that's more oppressed is, darker, and then that experience can't be done, and then get into that, how that creates sort of a oppression hierarchy in terms of, the ways in which we sort of rank forms of oppression. How dark your skin is means that you're more oppressed, which means that has to come first before I address these other structured forms of privileges, I think, is something that could be gotten at.
I think I was trying to talk about assimilating us, and it was hard for leftists, and I think that was from what they said, because black people are the enemy or the anti,
Right, obviously it's going to be harder for you two to pass than other people, but passing alone does not necessarily mean that you are not discriminated against, you don't face racial oppression. There's a wealth of literature about the model minority explaining why the model minority is an even more oppressed category than those that are experience explicit things, because then they're upheld as, you must be good at math and analytics, and then anyone who doesn't fit that, who happens to be Asian, is like, now you're just a bad Asian. Couldn't you have just done this as well? Look at all the other Asians who have fit in. And so there's a lot of evidence that talks about the model minority being a even more insidious form of racism, in the same sort of way that covert or unconscious racism is more insidious than some form of explicit racism. Because explicit you could challenge, the covert one is not as good. And how many people out there, when they're talking about statistics or talking about how blacks can't succeed, point to the Asian populations as, look, they just immigrated, now why can't you do this else? So this model minority does not just reinstitute Asian forms of racial domination, but also institutes forms of racial domination across the spectrum, because everyone's then compared to the yardstick of the model minority. And when you're like, you're just white now because you did this argumentation, and forget the way that you look, and it's just the text that you do, right? You're sort of going into some of the things that that could be criticized in that regards, and not paying attention to the ways that these sort of things could operate. And I think that if, again, you go back to sort of how the role of the judge can function in relation to that role of the ballot that you establish, what is the criteria I use, what does that ballot be able to do, then there could be a situation where I could be able to evaluate the negatives, assertion of their identities, the negatives performance in relation to what you have, so that way it's not just I vote for the methodology that I think is best, but I vote for a methodology that I think is best given certain forms of context. And I think that if on the negative side there's a counter discussion of that in relation to the role of the ballot, so that you set up, why theirs is bad, but then also then what my ballot would do, I think that would do the flip side, so that way not only do I can figure out why a certain role of me is bad, but why my ballot could be able to activate something separately.
So if I understand, so you agree that it's probably bad for you to vote for them, but you sort of do it anyways based on the 2AR analysis that's fail again, feel better.
I think that's part of it, and then also because suddenly there's a creation of I could affirm them outside of here when there isn't an outside of here, makes it seem like either I can never affirm them, or I have to create a separation of me in here and me outside of this room that I don't think is.
Well, maybe, but sorry, why does that mean you vote out?
It's a little bit of I don't know why to vote neg. Right?
Do you not think that we've won offense about why it would be bad for you to vote out?
I don't think that you've won offense for why it's good for me to vote neg. Right? So even if there's some reasons for why the AF might not be perfect, why is not being perfect a good enough reason to reject it?
So you don't think there's any benefit to voting negative?
Are you answering in the relation to the way the debate went down, or in relation to
the way the debate went down?
In the way the debate went down, I think that there is not a clear articulation for the benefits of voting neg outside of rejecting that style of performance. And I think that if it gets connected to how that ballot functions as a radical rejection of liberalism, and then that action does something more like that, I think that then I could see voting neg does something in opposition to that, right? So it's a little bit of
you just don't think that rhetoric is so. I understand that it wasn't as clear as it should have been, but that rhetoric is not absent from the 2NR. It's they continue liberal economies of pain. We should refuse to engage in the continual circulation of those stories. Is that not something to do that would engage with these questions?
Right, but I refuse to engage in this liberal form of stories, and then I leave the room, and and then I'm not really sure what I don't know how that has been a real rejection of a refusal to engage in these liberal forms of stories outside of just saying no, and then when I'm given the opportunities of how it could be able to situate otherwise, how I'll be able to resist different forms of racial oppressions, it seems to be difficult for me to figure out a way that we could ever do anything in order to be able to challenge these sort of things, right? In the quotes where you come, it's I should feel uncomfortable being able to, like, and I think he's right. I would feel more uncomfortable voting for them than I would feel for you in this instance. And I think that there could be
but you didn't. I don't like. I that's our argument, is that that's the comfortable white choice to make, is to vote for it because it feels better, and that's not challenging your privilege at all. So you continue to feel like you've. So you just don't think we've won these arguments about your ressentiment being important, or their arguments about the sort of ascetic priest ideal that they take.
I get your first thing. I don't know why my ressentiment would be important. Yes, that's true. I'm not sure why me feeling that ressentiment would be bad per se. Like, so I feel ressentiment. So I feel like I haven't done enough.
That's like the lash out argument. That then you go and when other repressions happen, you don't know how to engage with them, or you kind of freak out. Okay, that's fine. That wasn't explained very well.
So, because I got a quick question, because I was going to say, I don't care if you lash out after the round. I didn't know if that would be problematic, or if I should be okay, you lash out.
Well, you said, you experienced your ressentiment. That's good.
Yeah.
Experience it, right?
Yeah,
you say
I did,
that.
But I wasn't sure if I should.
I think
right.
you should. Because wasn't it the fact that most people are going to judge us are white? So, I mean...
Well, I mean, just because most people are going to judge you as white does not necessarily mean that you might have the most productive way to engage the white judge either, right? Because you don't really have a location for what the white judge should do in relation to you, right? Because you don't, right? You have a relation to regards to the role of the ballot and how the ballot should be able to function within that space, and I think that there's more of a discussion of the role of the judge by them than a role of the ballot by them, and you have more of a discussion of the ballot versus the judge, and that's where why I start my disclosure on that is that that's the issue that makes it that I go back and forth with in that regards, and I don't think that just voting negative to then foreground the whiteness of me and saying that white privilege is enough.
It's our whiteness, the fact that we are the white individuals here who have foregrounded ourselves and criticize that privilege that comes with. And our inability to grasp sort of the suffering of
and then that Gilmore evidence says that foregrounding the white privilege is not enough, right? That focuses on the whiteness is not enough.
You think that was in the debate? I mean, I get that card is good, but I don't feel like that argument was made at a very that's fine. The real question that I want to ask, but you think that it's problematic what they said about SUA, but it seems like nonetheless you just don't care. So how can we make you care? Because you just say it's bad that we shouldn't call them racist, which I find not the best phrasing, but it's racist to say that SUA is white. So, and I think we made that argument. I don't think there's a good answer. What more do we need to do there?
What more do you need to do there? I think that in order to get me to be able to win on that argument, I think that argument should be made comparatively to the things that they're saying that where they won't be able to perform their identities or be able to use autobiographies, because that seems to be the invisibility argument, right? So I think that a comparison between what's happened with Ensuo in that round in relation to what they're claiming is the way that their voices are not going to be able to be spoken anywhere because they can't do autobiographicals, they can't do the poetry, they can't take on the notions of the oppressed, right? I'm not really sure what they could do or I could do in the world of view outside of just saying no to liberalism, right? Or
Well, you're not just saying no to liberalism, you're also saying no to Sue as a erasure.
I think I think a comparative to it, I think that would be sort of the element to exist within, and I think that dropping to just that argument in the 2NR could potentially could be a way to get me, but there's all these other things that are going on, and that argument you flag as being separate, and I sort of see it as separate than the other ones, and I think that is something that could exist within it. But I also don't see there's a response, there's also a question of even if he's Asian and it's a form of, and the argumentation style is a form of whiteness, how is that necessarily what happens at that individual moment where and I think that impacting of model minority out a little bit more would be a way to be able to do that in relation to those other things.
Alright, when we get other teams that will talk about how we call those resentment to judges that are not black, how do we answer that? Or what's another way to answer that? I was thinking that the majority of the judges that are going to see us are going to be white, so how are we supposed to live?
I don't necessarily think that saying my experience of or seeing white judges experiencing resentment is a good thing is necessarily a bad argument to have. I think you might want to talk about with your coach to see if it's if that's the most strategic thing to do. But I think that when they're saying that I should feel uncomfortable, you could be like, that is a proof that you will continue to feel uncomfortable, or you will feel good for a moment and you'll feel uncomfortable and not know what to do on, later on. And they interpret what it means for resentment to then function for me in relation to others. And I think that could be, one way that you go about doing it. And you could also be like, we're not asking for your sympathy or recognizing that your ballot's going to do anything, right? Your ballot is a statement that we've won the debate round. It's not a statement that I didn't really fight racism or white supremacy in this round. I voted for the two of you, right? So you could be able to be clear about that. But what's really important is locating what the role of the judge is, and not just the role of the ballot. It's like, what do you want the white judge to do? And I don't think you can answer the question of what should you do to resentment until you for white judges, until you can figure out what you want the white judge to do in relation to your argument. Right, and I think that once you figure out what you want the white judge to do in relation to your argument, it's going to be much easier for you to figure out how to experience resentment. Do you want the white judge to feel comfortable? Do you want to have the white judge to feel comfortable? What is the ways that you want us to be able to engage in that space, opposed to just sort of being a conversation that takes place, for the two of you? Because I think in the earlier portions of the debate, I think it is. Thanks for being. I think in the earlier portions of the debate, I see a lot more of like what you're saying is that the ballot gives you visibility, and so now I vote for you, and so you're visible, right? That's giving me way more power than I think I have, and taking away the power that you two have for yourselves, right? If I vote against you and you become outraged, or other people become outraged, that creates a form of visibility as well, right? And I've definitely been in situations where, in similar rounds where I voted the other way, and I'll tell you, I felt a lot more uncomfortable and had my whiteness challenged a lot more in those moments than in the moments of this round right now. So to a large extent, what he told me at the end is also true, right? This allowed me to take the easy way because I thought that there was a better articulation of the role of the ballot versus the role of the judge, and I didn't know how their ballot functioned, but I didn't know how I functioned for you, but I didn't see it as a reason for why I should reject you, so I'm like, okay, affirmative in that sort of situation. But I know that had I voted negative in this instance, there's a lot of arguments and attacks that you could have levied against me for how this is just a form of whiteness, where I've ignored these different forms of identity, where I've rendered you invisible, and maybe that confrontation that I should have with you is the best way for me to challenge my whiteness in terms of this space. I don't know if you want me to feel that. I don't know. You can also have your speeches be more of an attack on the white judge as well, that operate within it, right? Because your questions of white privilege, or your card on white privilege, says it's not just about privilege, right? And I really like that card, because normally I address it as an issue of white privilege. I'm probably going to stop doing it after having read that card, because I see that very clearly as that privilege is only like, well, I understand how I'm advantaged in these ways, so not only figure how I can use my advantage in beneficial ways, but it doesn't recognize how no matter how I use my advantage in beneficial ways, all those benefits are always going to create other forms of disadvantages. But having that awareness that how my advantages are also creating disadvantages will be able to better navigate me through that sort of situation. So it might be worthwhile to actually call me out as an enemy, or the white judges as enemy, not as allies, right? There's not a space for us to be in a coalition yet, because I can't force you to be where I want to be. You can't force me where we want to be. The best we have is maybe a mutual understanding of where we want to move from here, opposed to something else, right? And so, like, maybe it's a question of being allies. I certainly don't think it's a question of being coalitions, because I don't think that racial dynamics in the moment where we can truly coalesce. But you can also, like, there's a lot of literature on being a race traitor. You could potentially ask white judges to be a traitor to the race as well. And so that, and if you look into critical whiteness studies, the white authors who are on that are all about being race traitors as a way to go about doing it. I don't know if that's productive, but it's another avenue that you could potentially look into in terms of doing that. But I think, like, figuring out what you want the white judge to do is really important. Do you want to be uncomfortable? Like, when I judged the Wake team, the lesbian separatists, like, they actively said I was an enemy. They actively said that the ballot should be a way to castrate myself and remove myself from the debate space, that we should not have males here. And it was like one of those moments, like, I don't like essentialistic forms of feminism or things like that, but it was also at the same point refreshing to just be called out, to be like, yeah, I might have gotten degrees in, women's studies in addition to, like, postmodern theory or whatever, etc. But, like, at the same point, I now am in a point of academy as a male, or someone who gets read as male, and that's taken away a seat in the academy for people who get read as female, because I got my degree and my privilege or supremacy allowed me to occupy that space. So maybe I do need to be called out as an enemy to females, and only by recognizing how I am bad can I really actually move forward. So, you could potentially be willing to call them out. There might be a wealth of white judges who would respond very negatively to being called an enemy. I think that the only way that white people, males, any people who occupy that privileged supremacist position could really effectively move forward is to recognize the ways that they are still instantiated and are enemies to these forms of things. Because otherwise, it's too easy for me to be like, well, in the spectrum of white people that exist in America, I'm far more on the left and an ally with like black feminism and intersectional attempts for queerness or whatever else. And that's an easy maneuver for me to be like, well, now I don't have to question these other ways. Or if I question, it's just a footnote in my mind, opposed to using this opportunity to be like, you are still fucked up. Your place here, I'm judging this round. Not a person of color, not a woman, I'm here. What does that mean, and why should I, why do I have the advantage point to sit here? Because being here doesn't matter who I vote for. I've already disadvantaged those, minorities who are not represented here. And so, it might be something that you want to play by judge what you want the white judge to do. And I think a lot will be open to being called out as being enemy. A lot will probably backlash, be like, fuck you, I'm not an enemy, I'm working with you. I'm not this type of person that you're saying, look at how I'm an ally, right? I know that, there's a bunch of people who will feel that way because they feel like they're working towards it. To me, I think the best way to work towards a mutual understanding is figuring out where we're, screwed up and fucked up, right? And I think that, like, some of the 1AC stuff that you did in terms of, like, motherhood and future motherhood definitely links to sort of, like, the Edelman, like, future forms of thinking that is anti-queer and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It seems like that link is apparent. And so, to me, that's a point where I think people should call you out on, like, your reinstantiation of that. And then you have a discussion of recognizing, yeah, we might not be perfect, but now let's figure out what to do with these different things, right? You can't erase your biological womanhood. You can't erase your motherhood. You can't erase your son and these sort of things. But to say that you just can't talk about it, right, doesn't mean, it, is also a violent act, right? So I think that you have to play with the abilities of, like, how we are, we are allies and enemies simultaneously, and how these places, like, I really like Poir terrorist assemblages in terms of the way in which the identities and resistance and privileges and supremacy occupy different temporalities and spatialities, different times and places. They operate differently, and at this time, at this tournament, at this place, there are very, very specific modes of power that are operational, and I think that you should address that, and address that in terms of every round, is what is that judge there, and when you have a panel and out rounds, you have a bunch of people that you could address in that space of that elimination round. And I think it's a lot more than just making the two of you visible, right? Because you're clearly visible, you're clearly on the radar, right? You've had news articles published on you. You can lose every tournament here on out, and you will still be visible. But being visible is not enough, right? Obama won the election. That's not enough, right? There's got to be something more than just winning a tournament or being, 8-0 or something like that. There's got to be something else that happens with that visibility. And so what to do for the judges, whether it be a white male, a black female, or whatever else, I think needs to be located. And I think you do a really good job of roll of the ballot, but a really bad job in terms of role of the judge. And I think that that's what they're doing better at than you, is the role of the judge question, but without a roll of the ballot. In this round, I was unsure what voting negative did, and I think I recognize the frustration because in the earlier portions of the debate, it was very clear in my mind how that roll of the ballot worked and why it was a criticism of you as a judge. You need me to hit the send button on the email, don't you? Okay. It's been sent. Sorry. I thought I filled it out and then I just didn't hit send. Right, and so, like, to me, like, that's where it both, where it fell through, and because the ballot showed me what it was doing versus how I should be located in the role of the judge, that they did was more of a criticism of how you put me in a space opposed to what they put me in. It was a way for me to vote affirmative in that round. I think a little bit more work by the 2-R and what my ballot does negative-wise, right? Margin of victory, I said 2-1 or whatever. Probably would have been 2-1, different panels, different ways. But, it, could have very easily then been a negative ballot, and the conversation would be, almost reversed, right? Yeah. So it's like you need to not just pay attention to the ballot, but pay attention to the judge. And the role of the ballot could stay the same, but the role of the judge should change based upon the judge, right? And based upon the place and the space that the judge happens to occupy at an individual time, because we're different people, we're in different spaces, different places. Me here at Wake Forest now is different than me here at Wake Forest in the elimination rounds, and different from me at Harvard or me at these other sort of places, right? And especially after what went down at Harvard, the way in which judges operate within space, like, is different now, right? And I think that you should pay attention to that to a certain extent, because that really shows Wake is the time for either the community to come together or be torn apart. And, it might not be great for the community to all come together and just sort of be like, okay, we've healed our racial bonds now because we've had a couple of sit-down powwows and now let's move on. And, that might be now we've taken care of racism, let me pat myself on the back in the same way I pat myself on the back. I voted for the black team, right? That's not doing anything. It's giving the ballot. What do I do beyond that? And that's sort of what their argument is that voting for you to just affirm your identity is not enough for me to do something else outside of there. But to me, what they did is still like it's still going to exist outside of there. So in that case, right, it's non-unique, right? And I think that the argument that you emphasize in the 2AR, I think that could be emphasized more throughout it, is that you have no other option, right? That co-opted, who cares? Numbed, who cares, right? The world is already numb to the oppression of the black female body, even if they might be aware of the oppression of the black male body, or even if they're aware of the oppression of the female body, right? And even if they're aware of the oppression of the black female body, not the black female mother with autistic child body, right? There's different forms of that are continuously going on, and so the awareness alone might not necessarily be enough, and I think you'd be able to do more with that.
Thank you.
Hey.
Love the feedback.
Yeah.
Like at the very beginning, you talked about the privilege argument. It's like how everyone having to be forward with their privilege might be bad, but everyone concealing their privilege would be bad. You had a phrase. You like set your like
Forced presencing.
Forced presencing.
Forced presencing.
So like academic.
Yeah, forced presencing or confessional is sort of like
Confessional presencing.
Well, no, I mean the two different things. Like Foucault talks about it as a confessional act, and he
Forced
talks
presence.
right, and Foucault talks about it as a confessional that we go to alleviate our sins, and that puts it back onto us, and talks about it as the priest that does that, and then now my sins are absolved, and it's just a way to feel good. But then you are disclosing yourself to the priest to judge you and give you what is your adequate punishment. And then Poir and Terrace Assemblage just talks about it as a forced presencing type situation, when you're forced to presence yourself in a specific time, even if sometimes you want to be able to remain invisible and not be seen, because that's a better way to be resistant when you're forced to presence yourself in a certain thing, right? And this is actually something that I saw one of the Liberty teams do. They were like, we can't necessarily disclose our full social location, because if we say certain things about ourselves, we could be kicked out of the school, we could be kicked off the team, right? So force people to presence themselves has a bunch of disastrous consequences that may not be beneficial. And when they say you must start with that, then they force you to presence yourself, or you lose the round. And then the only thing you say is presencing bad, which has decreased the range of conversations that you could then have as a result.
I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, thanks for debating. I did, again, really enjoy it.